Hey everyone, I'm Dave Otero, and I'm here at one of my favorite live rooms at the Band Cave Studios in Denver, Colorado. I've got my buddy Ruben's kit set up behind me, ready to track the new TETRARCH album. But before we dig into that, we're doing a massive microphone shootout with 12 different mics on Snare top. The snare we're using is my slightly worn but killer sounding Pearl Steve Ferroni Signature Series. It's a 14 by 6.5 inch brass shell drum similar to a Ludwig Black Beauty. For heads we have a Remo Emperor coated on top and a hazy snare side ambassador on bottom. On snare bottom mic I have my BeyerDynamic M201, which has been my go-to for snare bottom lately, and that will stay consistent throughout all of the tests. All snare, kick, and room mics are going through my Phoenix Audio DSR8 preamp, and the Rode TF5 overheads are going through a Grace M801 preamp. For the purposes of this test, all the other mics will be muted. Now on to the important bits. The mics we're testing today are, and I'm going to reference my notes so I don't forget any, an Audix D1, an Audix i5, a Sennheiser 421 and Sennheiser 441, a Shure SM57, a 57 with the Tab Fucking Works T58 transformer mod from ZenPro Audio, Shure Beta 57, a Pyle PDMIC78, which is a $14 mic I found on Amazon, a BeyerDynamic M201, which is the same mic we have on snare bottom. We're trying that on top as well. A Rode M5 condenser, a Rode NT3 condenser, and a Rode NT6 condenser. Special shout out to Rode Microphones for sending those mics specifically for this test. You guys are awesome. I'll have Ruben play the same small section for every test, and the only changing variable will be that snare top mic. I will adjust preamp levels if necessary and may do some additional level matching in post as well. After tracking, I'll take the session back to my studio and listen to the clips in my own control room to properly judge the results and give you my opinion on the group. All right, enough blabbing, let's get into it.
All right, now we're back at the studio, and I've had the chance to put some pretty extensive listening time in on these. And I will say, comparing this many microphones at one time can get overwhelming quick. The differences between them get a little cloudy by the time you're at microphone 7 or 8. And I would encourage you to go back and maybe compare specific microphones that you think you like best. I'll put timestamps for each mic in the description. And it's definitely going to take a few listens for you to really zero in on some of the nuances between all of these. Before we get into the individual microphone comparisons, I'll give you an idea of what you're actually hearing with the mix samples. So all we have in the DAW here are kick mics, snare mics. Toms are pulled all the way down just to keep them from being a factor at all. Overheads and the rooms. I've left the rooms a little lower than I might in a normal mix just because that can play a big part in the snare sound as well, and we're trying to zero in on that close mic, of course. And there is some processing happening across the entire kit, but I've left the snare top mic pretty minimal. So the snare bottom mic down here is mixed 15 decibels under, which is probably a little lower than I would normally have it, but again, trying to highlight that top mic. It is going through a little BX SSL 9000J console here. The only thing that's active is a little bit of compression. It's really just starting to light up this first row of gain reduction here. You'll see it in a moment as I play the tracks. And then the snare mic is then fed to the drum bus. It does have some other stuff on it. It has the BX Townhouse for just an overall drum compressor. I've got a foul filter here that's doing some balancing to the overall spectral shape. And then some slate tape just for some added beef and to kind of warm things up. And then I do have an instance of ozone here, just kind of taking care of some peaks to give us a little bit more consistent volume here. So this is maybe in line with what I would have as a rough mix while I'm tracking drums. This is by no means a finished mix, but it sounds good. It's got a decent balance to it, and just kind of trying to emulate where we might end up in a mix scenario. So I'll play a bit of one of these tracks here, and you can get an idea of what these processors are doing to the sound. So as I began to dig into these clips, I had to formulate what my criteria for judging them would be. First and foremost would just be how it picked up the source, you know, how each mic presented the same snare drum and the same tuning. And the second part would be the bleed characteristics, both how much bleed there was overall, and then how neutral or natural that bleed sounded. Obviously, there are lots of tools for gating snares or expanding snares to control that bleed as much as possible, but there's no way of getting rid of it completely. And at a point a snare drum is being hit, those tools will open up the signal all the way, so you're going to get bleed no matter what at the peak of the snare drum. And if you're riding on a crash and that gate or expander opens up on the snare drum and all of a sudden you get a blast of 4K or something from an undesirable bleed, it's absolutely going to affect your overall drum sound. So that almost became one of the primary things I would listen for. And there were definitely a few surprises. I'm not going to extensively go over every microphone here because this video would end up being an hour long, and I'll let you guys really develop your own opinions. You can go back and listen to those samples again, as I mentioned. But I'll talk about my favorites and a few surprises. So my favorite ended up being the Sennheiser 441 for this particular source, and it is what we ended up using on the album. And while it's not the most exciting sound to begin with, I really appreciated how clean the bleed was and how just natural it sounded. The crash he's riding on for all these clips sounded really smooth in that microphone, and maybe didn't have the least amount of bleed, but I felt like it was the most likely to soak into the overheads and the rest of the overall picture of the drum set and be less apparent. So let's go ahead and solo this one in place with the minimal amount of processing I have going on, and we can see what it sounds like. And when we compare that with a previous favorite of mine, the Audix D1, we can definitely hear the difference in that bleed characteristics. So once again, the 441. and the D1. Yeah, even with no EQ and no boost, that cymbal is already harsh as hell, and I'm not into it. It sounds kind of exciting on first listen when you just bring it up with the rest of the kit, but as we start adding processing, I think we're really just going to enhance some of the issues that this mic has with kind of like a peaky upper mid, and I was honestly pretty disappointed with its representation. Let's go ahead and add some pretty basic EQs, something that I would typically do to almost any snare mic, and see how that maybe changes how these are perceived. Let's start with the 441. I'm going to tighten up my loop here. I'm going to put a Pro Q right on the snare top channel, and we'll kind of dial this in how I might normally. Actually, I'll just do that before I even play it, because I have some moves that I would probably start with on almost any drum, and it's just going to be some low pass and high pass. For a big fat sound like this, I'm going to want to push some lows, probably push some highs as well, and pull out something around the 500 hertz range. Let's see what this sounds, and we can adjust a little bit. Now, we did bring up some undesirable stuff in the upper mids here that we would take care of later, but I'm going to leave this pretty basic for right now, and we'll skip around and see how that applies to some of the other microphones. So let's do that same test between the 441 and the Audix D1 again. Yeah, I realize that's a bit unfair because I dialed this EQ in with the 441, but even if we zero in here, let's see if we can attack some of these upper mid frequencies. And back to the 441. I mean, the difference in the bleed sound there is just kind of out of control. And I think that's what I liked about the 441. It was a less exciting of a sound up front, but it just seemed to be the most malleable. I feel like I could take this and turn it into almost anything I wanted and have those desirable bleed attributes as well. So let's go ahead. Let's see. I'm going to pull these down a bit, get rid of this guy, have a little bit more of a neutral EQ curve. And let's check out the NT6 as well. Now again, I kind of feel the same way about this NT6 as I do about the 441. It's a pretty neutral sound overall. It has some bleed for sure. It's not quite as subdued as some of the dynamic microphones, but that bleed is so much more natural sounding, and it's just going to be less apparent in a final mix in any kind of gating or expansion scenario, that while it's definitely there, you won't notice it as much when it kicks in and out, and it feels pretty malleable. And it's a condenser microphone as opposed to most of these others, which are dynamic, so it definitely comes at it with a different sound, but I have, since I recorded these clips, paired those two, the 441 and the NT6 on snare top, and it has been amazing. I feel like I get almost any sound that I could ever want out of a snare drum with just those two microphones on snare top. So I really did enjoy this one. And again, just for reference, I'm going to go back to the D1. I hate to keep on just ribbing on this microphone, but it really did kind of shock me how unnatural this one ended up sounding. not a fan. The Audix i5 has a similar shape to the D1. It's not quite as harsh, actually. But compared to the 441, yeah, I feel like I'm just getting a much cleaner source there. Another one of my previous favorites was, of course, the SM57. It's a pretty classic sound on snare drum, and I particularly had been using my Transformer modified version, as I felt it had a slightly warmer, kind of like low, mid, woolly push sound. It performs well here, but wasn't really my favorite for this type of drum. I think it might be more useful on a slightly higher tuned drum, or a crackier, less weighty type of sound. But let's go ahead and hear it with a little bit of processing. So it's nice. It just doesn't really give me that weighty push that I'm looking for, the nice beefy smack that you can really feel in your chest. But it's no slouch by any means, and still a viable option for snare top. Now, I didn't include the Rode M5 and NT3 in the clips, and that's because the combination of those two microphones with my Phoenix Audio DSR8, I just really couldn't get the gain low enough. They both have a pretty high output, and I'm not sure if it's just that output's too high, where the DSR8, the baseline gain is a little higher than it may be on some other preamps, or if it's just, you know, straight up on a snare, which is about as demanding as you can of a source you can put on a microphone for SPL handling, if it just was too much for those microphones. But the M5 was close to being able to handle it. I'll play you a bit of that now. It doesn't sound terrible, but you can tell the transients are being clipped on the way in, and the NT3 was just absolutely blown out. So that's not even remotely usable. I have, since this test, picked up this Shure inline attenuator, and that may be able to help eke out a little more range out of these two microphones, but unfortunately I didn't have it for these tests. Two microphones that I unfortunately was unable to include in the test would be the Josephson E22 and the Telefunken M80 and M81. Both of those are highly regarded for snare top. I've unfortunately never been able to use either, but I definitely want to, and hopefully I'll be able to get a hold of those at some point and be able to include them in a future video. I think that about wraps us up for today. Again, if you enjoyed that video, please consider subscribing to the channel. Hit that like button, hit that bell notification, do all the things you're supposed to do. And then in the comments, let me know what you think. Which is your favorite microphone? Do you agree with my thoughts on the 441 versus the D1 versus the NT6? What's your favorite mic on snare top that I didn't touch on today? There's always that unknown microphone waiting out in the weeds ready to just destroy all of these. So do you know what the next secret weapon for snare top is? Please leave it in the comments below, and I'll see you on the next one.